Jai Hind viewers, today we come back to you again with another session where we have a panel discussion, and we have got some very eminent panelists with us. And today we are bringing to you expert views on storage, preservation, and mothballing, which is a very crucial part of equipment, looking after equipment. So, to introduce the panelists, we have with us Lieutenant General Dr. Anil Kapoor, who served as the Director General Electronics and Mechanical Engineers and Director General Infosystems. He is a chartered engineer. He was awarded the Eminent Engineer Award 2020 by Institution of Engineers. He is a professor of practice at IIT Tirupati and also a board member in their innovation hub. He writes and speaks on emerging technologies like C7ISR and artificial intelligence in many publications and platforms. We have also Major General Ranjit Ghosh, who served as the Additional Director General and Colonel Commandant of Corps of Electronics and Mechanical Engineers. A postgraduate gold medalist from IIT Madras in maintenance engineering, he was Chief Managing Director of Army Base Workshop, which was looking after A vehicles. At strategic level, he steered life cycle engineering support for Army's capital acquisition. And General Ghosh has authored books on global defense industries and technological bases, and is a strong proponent of disruptive technologies for defense transformation. We also have with us Air Commodore DB Murali. He has retired in June 2021 after 35 years of service and has worked in MROs for aircraft and aero engines. He has worked in fighters mainly and also flown multi-engined aircraft as flight engineer. He was instrumental in induction of a trainer and fighter aircraft into service. He was key in the reliability improvement program of a frontline fighter engine abroad and has also worked at RCMA. He is a recipient of 3 Chief Commendation Cards and a President's Award. He is now VP at GMR, in charge of the Defense MRO at Hyderabad. We also have with us Commander Sonal Saxena. He is a naval aeronautical engineer with MTech. He is qualified on Russian turboprops, was Chief Manager of Naval Engine Holding MRO with experience of all naval Russian engines, long and short-term storage. Chief Manager Aircraft Production in Naval Second and Third Line MRO with experience of aircraft long-term storage towards operational requirements and dispatch and receipt for major overhauls at OEM foreign locations. Fleet Program Manager at Aviation Headquarters, including overhaul contract drafting and execution. So you can see we have got a very, very rich and experienced panel. So my first question to the panel is, I will seek your initial thoughts on this very important topic. May I request General Anil Kapoor to give his views?
Thank you, sir, and Jai Hind, everybody. It's again a pleasure to be on the MRO Digest forum. Now, in the spectrum of activities in asset management, when we look at asset management, and asset is could be an equipment, could be inventory. I think there are 2 mega agencies which we look at. One is the production agencies, and one is the user agencies. When we look at this complete spectrum, I think storage is one of the key ingredients of preserving and maintaining asset life, if I may say. And therefore, if we look at it from a user perspective, we normally see periodic preventive maintenance and, of course, breakdown maintenance whenever it breaks down. But when you look at it purely from a storage perspective, it's largely periodic and preventive maintenance to maintain the useful life and reduce downtimes whenever an equipment is exploited. From a production agency perspective, when you have a surge in your production and your supplies are not as much, you have to keep the equipment with you, and therefore preservation becomes more or less a mandated requirement. So I think from that perspective, Mothballing is a very, very important activity. And given the technology landscape today, whether it is electronics equipment or it is a mechanical equipment, there is a lot of promise when we look at mothballing. And in a user environment, in case we envisage long times when equipment would not be used, especially like in peace areas and other areas, I think it's a good command decision to mothball and preserve the equipment so that your maintenance costs go low. And of course, there are drills for both mothballing and demothballing. So that's my initial comment on this.
Thank you, General Kapoor. May I have General Ranjit Ghosh to give his views?
Thank you, sir, for introducing me to the viewers. Preservation, mothballing, and storage. It starts with storage, looking at the civil or the military aspect. Going back to civil, it was, I think, probably the Great Recession back in the 1930s, which kept factories out of service for some time, in which they had just packed off the hazardous chemicals and just left the machinery to stay. And when it got back, it was not able to get it back into action in terms of usage. As far as the military perspective goes, I think we have been doing it for high cost equipment again, wherever there is a requirement to preserve the equipment and yet bring it back into action at the shortest possible time, for which various methods have been adopted and various technologies have come in to carry out this kind of a preservation effort, which has certain amount of work instructions and other things which goes into it to go as per the checklist to ensure that the equipment, once decommissioned for permanently or for temporarily, can be brought back into use in the shortest possible time, giving it all the required features in terms of its operational performance and battle endurance, which we are looking out of it in times to come. That should be my opening remarks. We'll follow it up with detailed discussions here.
Certainly, certainly. May I now request Air Commodore Murali to give his initial thoughts?
Good evening to you, sir, all of you. And, I would like to segregate this topic into two areas, and this are airborne platforms and the non-airborne platforms. And when it comes to airborne platforms, it is the kinematics of it, the dynamics movement areas, like, for example, the landing gear, the engines, controls. All these areas has to be identified as critical areas in while it go for storage, and whether it is short-term, long-term, or for an infinite period like we had in the COVID times, especially in the commercial side. So these areas has to have a separate identity and a periodicity. There are areas like glass panes, composite panels. Nowadays, most of the aircraft are having composites in the control surfaces, especially. These have to be given a separate treatment. Basically, it has to be covered in a no use of tape and all this. This has to be covered with proper covers, especially aluminum foil covers, which can be used. And also, adhesive. There are certain adhesive tapes which are cleared for aircraft surfaces. You should use only that. People have mindlessly used all that normal commercial tapes, and then you land up into problem, including peel off of paint, and which can cause subsequent corrosion as it flies. The tires has to be taken care, the rubberized items. Basically, the tires has to be covered and it has to be also rotated. The aircraft has to be moved once in 15 days so that the contact area is, is not the same. Because any contact area for more than time, the cracks start developing from there and the tires, it spreads all around the circumference of the tire and the tire can fail. So these are some issues. Then probes covering has to be properly with the probe covers, not with plastic foil, because that can attract moisture rather than it will be more counterproductive than trying to help out. Pitot tubes covering is very important because any ingress of FOD into that in terms of insect or dust or anything can be disastrous. We had quite a bit of failures in aviation because of that. Connectors, no cannibalization on storage aircraft, but it is very easy to say. But if at all you are cannibalizing, take care of those exposed areas, including the mounting of those components. And also, it is very important that connectors are properly covered and taken care, because ingress of moisture into the connectors is not desirable for whether it is airborne or non-airborne. All the outflow valves has to be closed, and where it is required to be open, it has to be open. So this, basically, I always used to insist that there has to be a checklist for preservation. Don't take it for granted. Generally, people go with the memory. make a checklist of critical, non-critical, semi-critical, and non-critical areas, and have a supervisory role in accordingly in those 3 areas. As you know, the most of the aircrafts and systems are come out with newer materials, and they're all lightweight because of the increase in thrust to weight ratio, which is desired for most of our aircraft and helicopters. So these materials are very good. The fracture toughness is something which gets affected when you go in for this kind of non-conventional listing, and that place where there is any debonding, delamination, or for that matter any corrosion, the failure can be disastrous and it can be sudden. So preservation becomes extremely important for these areas, especially now with engines coming out with CMCs, ceramic matrix composites, especially on the blades. They're very should be taken care very well in terms of preserving. When it goes to
thank you, Commander Murali. You have given us a little picture.
Yeah.
We'll go into the details again. Let me bring in
details, I'll just cover the non-airborne parts. Non-airborne parts also is equally important, because we had a recent failure in one area
Go ahead.
where a support equipment was used on the aircraft to particularly check a vertical fin area, and it collapsed and fell on it and damaged the aircraft. Because when they found that this equipment was not used for a long time and it was not preserved at all. So that's all I'm telling you. It's equally important that both sides are taken care. That's all my introductory.
Thank you. Cdr Sonal Saxena, please go ahead. Give your views, initial views.
Sir, as brought out very rightly, Goli sir, and other eminent panelists, I'll just like to add on an important part of the preservation is during transportation of equipment, especially aero engines or aircraft also for overalls when we send to the OEM. So for that purpose also you require a very efficient mothballing, because the airboat damage that can happen otherwise can be very costly. So that's my add-on, sir. Rest during the discussion, I'll continue adding as what we require generally, what my experience has been over the time, especially with Russian engines and Russian aircraft, and then especially during their transportation time.
Yeah, so it's been sort of my experience is that no matter how much you do, when you do mothballing or you storage, there is some deterioration which always creeps into the equipment. And so there are 2 elements which come into it. Number one is the aspect of cost. How critical the equipment is which you should go in for mothballing, because it's an expensive option, both mothballing, demothballing. And the second issue is how long would you like to keep it, and how will you inspect while in storage? Because if you do an inspected storage, then how do you detect the deterioration? So is there anything the panel, anybody can start? Anybody who would like to talk about it? It's open to any panelist to this question. 2 aspects. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Commander Murali, please.
Sir, is the user awareness while operating. I'll take a quick example of this, which will close my point. In one of our aircraft which we received from a neighboring country, they came for a normal C checks, and then we started doing it. And when you opened up, we were shocked. Even the stringers were powdering up, load-bearing members. Then when we investigated and we talked to them, and now the aircraft is still with us after the last 6 months. And we have changed almost the whole this thing. Boeing has said that we can't recover it, and we recovered it and at half the cost of what Boeing has told, if at all they had to recover. Then we found in the cargo, unknowingly, the operator is carrying fish. And the fish, along with putting ice, they were using it. And you know which country I'm talking about. And the whole area was corroded because of that saltish, this thing. And putting salt, water, and something like, carrying a food beverage is something like, it only, accelerated the whole corrosion process. From nose to tail, it was corroded. So user awareness while operating is equally important that for an aircraft to be preserved well, because these are the areas. The aircraft will operate at various places. So how it is, like if it is flying in Andaman Nicobar, the saltish environment, it has to be given a separate care. When it's flying in Delhi area or in Bangalore, there's a different scenario altogether. That is point 1. So the second point is the people also tend to, in order to avoid long-term preservation, they tend to take the short-term preservation and keep, 15 days of ground run, 15 days ground run, and then keep on doing it to avoid the long-term preservation. This is very bad. You have to decide. You should know your infinite period or is it a finite period, and accordingly you should plan. Because that 15 days run-up is only applicable for once or twice. It is not for long, because there are, other than engine, the run-up is only for engines and little bit of systems movement. But there are many parts like the undercarriage, the wheels, they're all not, getting preserved with the engine run-up. So it is very important that people should be made aware that long-term preservation should be defined and done in these two spirits, not in splits of short-term preservation, which is easier.
Absolutely. In fact, this is what is the point. Even if there's a checklist and an instruction which is there, if it is not followed, then sometimes after mothballing the equipment, it becomes worse than what it was originally, and you have to spend so much more money to bring it back. General Kapoor, you wanted to say something on this?
Okay,
General Kapoor, please.
there are two things we have to basically look at when we look at mothballing or preservation. One is the temperature, the other is the humidity. And I think these are the two very important parameters which need to be controlled. And I'll just allude on two experiences recently which I had. I had been to the Nissan showroom. There are two things we have to keep in mind. First is temperature and second is humidity. And recently I had visited the Nissan showroom where they've got a huge warehouse where more than maybe 1,000 vehicles were parked of different variants of Nissan. And the second is I visited the Apple store where again there is a huge amount of parking of a lot of Apple assets, iPads, Macs and mobile phones. And in both the cases, the common denominator was that they were maintaining a temperature, humidity, and even light. The amount, because the paint and everything gets affected. So firstly, there are a lot of skylighting that they had done. They had some intelligent glass, which was introducing skylighting in a manner what was optimally required. The temperatures were being monitored. So really speaking, I'm just talking of a commercial environment where maintaining these kind of controls is very important, because when you and me buy a car or we buy a mobile, which most of us do, we would look at as absolutely new, the brilliant shine, the brilliant gloss and everything. So it is very difficult to maintain these, especially when equipment gets manufactured somewhere and stored somewhere else. So I think there were some very unique examples that I saw of very high class preservation. And like what Air Commodore alluded to, they had a huge checklist. And on a weekly basis, they would visit a zone. So they had zoned up the whole area. And there was a Monday zone, Tuesday zone, Wednesday zone, where they would go down to see a sample equipment or a sample thing so that there's no deterioration. So that was one very important learning. The second was a lot of these spares were lying with them. So it is not only the full asset, the mega cost center is also the spares, the technical spares that are there. And of course, we all know the basics of preservation, but even there, everything was so well controlled in terms of environment, because they felt that the biggest concern is environment. Now, as far as Murali alluded to, tires and all, most of these vehicles were actually on a platform and the tires were not touching the ground at all. They were not touching the ground. So they were little elevated. And the point at which the elevation was happening, that means the touch on the axles, that point was also being shifted every week. So that the stresses, so really speaking, it's quite a technical activity when we look at it from a perspective of longevity. And what you correctly yourself mentioned, that most of the times when we don't take care of all the intricacies that are involved, because in our warehouses, typically we feel that if we mothball the equipment, we have preservatives for the equipment, but the environment around the equipment we don't bother about.
Very good.
perhaps
Actually,
that is
what
where
what you have given, General Kapoor, is a very interesting
deterioration which
point.
happens with time, because that environment is very important to control as well. So I think when we look at mothballing, we have to look at maybe if we were to look at the armed forces on a station basis, or some mothballing stations where major assets come and we create the warehousing for it.
I'm going to come to warehousing because that is a separate aspect which I want to also touch upon. General Ghosh, go ahead, please.
Sir, what I see, mothballing or preservation or storage requirement is for an industry which is got a cyclical demand and recovery of demand or supply. This could be in the case of civil street, it could be your oil rigs, which are going in for drilling and exploration to boost oil supply whenever as and when required. So part of the industry has to be put into mothballing or preservation, whereas part will function as per the demand. The partial to full optimal utilization of the resource will take place. Coming on to aircrafts, civil or military, COVID saw the aircraft industry totally drying up. There was no aircrafts taking off, so there was no demand. So there was a requirement of long-term storage. Now suddenly we started releasing, okay, these sectors will fly with all the checks and this thing. So the demand started increasing. Slowly from long-term preservation, you came on to short-term preservation of a segment of aircrafts. Similarly, you come on to your naval vessels and so on. And next point regarding the factors, it is all the environmental factors which are critical. We go to deserts, you have the air quality, which is important. You may require temperatures which are very high, so you require air conditioning. You may have relative humidity very high, you may have dehumidifiers. You may have ultraviolet protection for the sunlight. You go into coastal areas, you have vapors, sea vapors, salt vapors, which is got to be guarded against. You have microorganisms. You go into high altitudes, you have got certain amount of there is fatigue on the equipment in terms of failures taking place, which have to be guarded against. So the environmental factors are plenty, and how we have to guard against each is the methodology which I just came out with. It could be air conditioning, it could be dehumidifiers, it could be your coatings in terms of ultraviolet or water protection, it could be your chemical protection, ionic protection, it could be your you call them those hermetically sealing of the environment. So there are a whole lot of methods in which you can do this packaging. There are different methods for aircraft, there are different methods for ships, there are different methods for the tanks or other military equipment, which we all have been practicing during our service life, and we have seen that the whole crunch is each of these factors have to be looked into. When you have a checklist, you have to guard against. First action is cleaning of the dust. Now dust.
Yeah. So I'll come to the checklist and this thing once again. I'll come back to that. But
Right.
Commander Sonal Saxena has been waiting to say something. Go ahead.
Sir, just as Anil Kapoor brought it out, the third factor, salinity, which is very prominent on naval vessels, naval ships, and the aircraft that we operate in. Salinity plays a major role. And same in mothballing or storage and preservation, our depots, our operating environment, they're all in a very high saline environment. So it makes a lot of difference if you factor that. And the only solution to this is, I think, vacuum based or controlled AC spaces, air conditioned spaces, where you can do this preservation. But then during operation, you obviously have to bring it out. And there are factors that like compressor wash and all that we undertake, or the aircraft wash. Nearly after every sortie, we have to wash the aircraft with fresh water to remove that salt content. So during preservation of components and all, it becomes much more prominent that this kind of an ingress does not take place.
Very much for that. But now I will come to we have Anil Kapoor mentioned infrastructure. Anil Ghosh also mentioned. All of you have mentioned infrastructure. Before I go on to that, Air Commander Murali, you had your hand up earlier. Would you like to say something now?
Sir, I want to add one point onto General Kapoor's point of environment. The another environmental factor is the availability of the right casings. Like for example, I've seen in many places, including Army, Air Force, Navy, the rotor blades are removed and kept on on two wooden blocks, and that's not the way. We forget when you buy the equipment to get the correct cases to store it. So this is a very important aspect. The storage, some limited numbers. If you are buying 10 aircraft, then you should buy at least 2 to 3 cases, wherein these critical components like rotor blades, landing gears, your wheels, hubs, everything can be stored correctly in a correct perspective of preservation. Second point, which I would like to add in that environment is Improper use of cleaning solutions. This is another issue. If you look at any imported equipment, you will find the cleaning solution is given a chemical coded number. We don't use. We just go to the market and we don't get it. Neither we procure it on a long-term basis or we foresee it while procuring. And then you are doing crisis management and then buy something which is available in the market, and that accelerates, degradation.
Now I'm going to come back to Anil Kapoor and I'm going to request him. He had, the thing about infrastructure. Now, what little I've seen, and I'll request Anil Kapoor to answer this to start with. What I have seen is that these storage facilities are very expensive to create. And not only that, the maintenance of the storage facility itself is a big challenge. Because when you are in our environment, when you are creating, especially in slightly remote areas, where you need continuous electricity for everything, and you need a particular level of construction, so it sometimes becomes a challenge. So I heard Anil Kapoor mention station, according to some station where some infrastructure could be created. That's one aspect. And how is it that within that we have to make a system wherein, like as was mentioned by Anil Kapoor, that storage of Apple electronics, storage of cars, and then maybe some other equipment may be requiring different type of zones. So is it possible to create somehow economic manner in which to do these infrastructure, and any ideas on that, so that it is not too expensive, at the same time we are able to save our equipment? Anil Kapoor?
Sir, brilliant question. Thank you for that. Now, actually, when we look at mothballing, it's a very, very expensive activity for sure. Because what you need is actually more ruggedized what you need under operating conditions. Because under operating conditions, there's a lot of maintenance going on. But under storage conditions, you would ideally not like to maintain it much. You would just about assess the visuals, whatever visually is available. And therefore, I would say that now, like today, you got these anaerobic adhesives, which actually don't stick. It's like post-it pads. You apply them, they create the necessary shield and give you the necessary protection, and you can just wipe it off. So these are materials available today. Then when we look at tapes, normally we use cellophane tapes, but there are these Captain tapes, CAPTU and Captain tapes, which actually create the DMS protection in all ruggedized systems. So these are the tapes which have to be bought, and commercially, most of them may not be available in the right quality that we are looking at. Then, of course, ruggedized greases are there, normal greases are there, and then there are rugged greases. You have to use rugged greases and not otherwise. And then today, what I've also seen is PVC flexi materials. Now, these flexi materials have come, which have got the strength of PVC, but they are flexible. And somebody mentioned, I think Sonal mentioned about vacuuming. So obviously, one good way is if you could, and actually this is a good area for research. I would say that when we look at MRO and when we look at preservation, it's a good area for research as to how do we mothball, because the costs are going to be high, but how do we mothball maybe for 2 years or 3 years? Because that's a good time, 2 to 3 years, wherein you may like to get a warehouse where in turns you mothball, or big warehouse where you in turn mothball. And it's a jacket, if I may say, a PVC jacket of a tank. Just let's look at it that way, where the hull and turret has one jacket and the barrel has one jacket, and then you suck out the air and you create the vacuum, and then you create the de-vacuum, so that the complete equipment is well maintained with if the environmental factors which we've all talked of in the previous talk a little while from now, if they are maintained, I think you can be rest assured that nothing adverse will happen to your equipment. So that kind of assurance would be required. And while that is mechanical, when we look at electronics, I think that's another challenge, because most of our communication sets also don't get utilized as much, and a lot of other similar equipment. And therefore, since it is a smaller equipment, it would definitely be possible. And I think one of the fallouts of this digest could be that let's do some meaningful research in the area as to how do we create vacuum-based systems for effective mothballing. And of course, look at some simpler materials which could give a similar impact.
Sonal, you were saying something, you put a message here about containers, etc. Sonal?
Sir, moisture prevention, rats are there. The major problem that is to maintain integrity of such containers. You have you generally create a negative pressure or a vacuum inside the bag, but there are chances during transportation or during storage also they degrade, and then there is a puncture might happen into the container or due to deterioration in the seals. So that is where that is a one very big challenge. It's a very expensive process not only to do it but also to maintain that for during the period of storage.
That's important, very important. General Ghosh, you wanted to say something?
Sir, I see this subject of preservation, mothballing, and storage in two parts. One is the main platform or the weapon system in the land forces case, and second is the assembly level and below of the same item. While the complete platform per se, mothballing may be a costly effort, the parts of it is much easier. So what I see it is that when we suppose we take a tank, when we want to mothball the tank, the complete tank, if it is mothballed, is got different systems where Anil Kapoor brought out. You have a shroud, you put it under that. You have a dehumidifier going with air supply points, giving the air, and that's the cheapest version. Then you have this vacuum system where you're pulling it out and creating more. It is slightly more costlier. So the cost will go up as per the sophistication that is available for that particular process for the weapon plant. Coming on to the sub assembly level, if you see, the system is just to give a protective coating, which could be any of the materials which Anil Kapoor just brought out. That protective coating is to protect. It is just a shroud sort of a thing again, or a film, which is protecting you against the ultraviolet as well as the water and other things. And while packing it in, if it's a part like maybe a crankshaft, the crankshaft will have a cover of this protective film, which is being put inside. That they put these those desiccants capsules which pulls the water, and thereafter they put some flame to seal it off. So it becomes a plastic coated sealed entity which has been pulled out of vacuum and other things. So all kinds of protection has come into it. That is one part. So that part is easy to do. Same thing is with our other things which comes out. Suppose it's a tank. Now you have got the sighting system coming out. While you take out the sighting system, what is important, what Murali brought out, there is a proper casing which is there for that. We should have that casing when we procure it. Inside that casing, you should have the silica gels. You see the frequency of silica gels. Is it white or is it gone pink? If it's gone pink, then you remove it, put the new one. There should be a periodicity of that also. Similarly, if you go in for laser equipment, you have to range it and see if it's giving the right ranges. You have to carry out nitrogen purging. If it is getter activation may be involved. So these all are checklists of each of the sub-assemblies after they have been protected against environmental factors. So this is how I am looking at this subject in the civil as well as in the military. This is how they are proceeding. I saw the Lakeup in one of the videos where this kind of a thing is happening. So it is there in military systems, it is there in civil systems, which is getting adopted today.
Very nice. So, Murali has been wanting to say something. Please go ahead.
Sir, I had one point very bad. The vacuum packing, all the panelists has rightly covered that. It's very important that before you vacuum pack, you clean the surface. You know, generally people don't do that. I mean, and clean the surface in terms of dust, grease, and any deposits. And without that, if you do it, actually, you are actually aiding, the degradation. Second issue is there is a corrosion inhibitor spray which comes.
This is a very important point to make. You know, you are making a very important point that without that, you pack it, you are actually creating a space where the deterioration will accelerate.
Yeah, you're trapping the guy inside, and then it really adds to that. And the second is the corrosion inhibitor, basically for cutting off the oxygen. There are vapor sprays which are basically molecular barriers, which comes and that can be sprayed in case you are finding it too critical and more corrosion prone, like you have in army the weapons and the armored vehicles everywhere. We can use that corrosion spray too in case you are finding it difficult to vacuum pack. So these are the 2 points I wanted to add on that. And the anti-rodent traps. This is also another thing which, especially for the aircraft, when it is not jacked up, we need to have this, because rodents are also another threat to the whole preservation when it comes to bigger equipment.
So, Anil Kapoor, you wanted to say something? Please go ahead.
I think it's been brilliantly covered by everybody. Some points which have come to my mind now are that, firstly, I think we need to bring this mothballing into the R&D ambit. While, all of us, all the services, and even in the civil, there's a huge checklist with everybody, and cleaning and all these things very much form part of it. But I think with the current trends in technology, it can be done much more efficiently and much better. So one is, I would propose as a part that let DRDO take this on to come up with mothballing strategies for various systems, if I may say. So if it is an airborne system, if it's a naval system, and terrain-based, what are the various value adds they can make in this activity? The second is, I think the OEMs would also do it well if they were to be able to come up with a strategy and recommend to the user that if your equipment, especially in the defense, since the use times are much less than the storage times, what would be a good strategy? They could give a mothballing strategy, because they do have a lot of visibility, and I'm sure in their own environment also, they would like to propagate this thought, because today with exports, the amount of time an equipment spends in storage or transit is huge, and especially if it is a ship transit. So therefore, I think that could be a second important thing. And the third is that wherever our infrastructure exists, we need to create some technology-based monitoring systems, which could be actually visual and something through signals. That means we could have sensors and IoTs, something like a litmus test. I mean, we all remember from our childhood that moment you would put a litmus paper, you would make out if it is alkaline or is it acidic or things. So really speaking, we need to create those kind of triggers, litmus test triggers in this mothballing, so that sitting in a room, if there's any change which needs to be in a particular piece of equipment which needs our attention, you immediately home on to that. I think with technology today, all these things need to be given a different hue than most of us have been used to in our service. Because in our service, it was more physicals. I think it can be largely virtual with on call. I mean, depending on the trigger on call that you attempted. So I thought I'll just share this.
Yeah, very good. I think with IoT coming in, these things which you say, very modern aspects can be brought in. Now I'm going to just shift tack a little bit, and I'm going to ask a question related to HR. So with the, my little bit of experience in this is that the responsibility, if the responsibility of the person who's going to be maintaining it in storage is different from the person who's going to eventually revive it and then use it, then it is a problem. Because, if something goes wrong, he says, I did everything possible and now it's gone wrong. On the other hand, if a person somehow, the team or at least a part of it is required to use it later, and the responsibility aspect of who is the person how is it that we handle the technical HR properly, so that when you revive it, because of people not following the procedure, the checklists, things reduce. After all, you can police only up to a point. You can only check up to a point. So on the aspect of HR, and how would you like to strategize the HR? Any views on that? Anybody? Yeah, General Ghosh, you want to say something? Go ahead.
So regarding the HR aspect, I think Anil Kapoor has rightly hit on to the point of there is a OEM's role, there is a engineering role, but it is essentially an engineering activity. So how much is the user share is there, but it is very minuscule because of very few reasons, major reasons being. Firstly, the technical activity is understood best to the technical or the mechanics. Now there has to be a team formed. You have to have a mothballing or preservation or storage manager, but I see it that way, who should be drawing out the strategy for the complete platform as well as the subsystems. You should have a nucleus which has got more of mechanics, technicians, and less of operators, but there has to be certain amount of operators as well. These should take in the inputs of the OEM who is interested in the performance Yet he's also interested in failure so that he gets a substitute equipment in. But yet he gives out the checklist for each of these sub-assemblies. They are different part manufacturer, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 manufacturers who are getting into the whole complete system. So each is laying out their storage and preservation requirements and the methodologies, which has to be overseen by this manager who is planning the whole thing, and this team, which is should be a nucleus for each shop floor, which means it could be a telecom shop, it could be a laser equipment shop, a TI shop, or a metallurgy shop. Each of these will have a nucleus and the overseen by their mothballing managers. That is how this whole thing will actually happen in the way the checklists have been defined and in the way they should actually be done. That is how I
Very
see
nice. Good, good. Sonal, go ahead.
One challenge in this is the components or the major assemblies. They pass through various transition points. During transportation, during store depots, you'll have the logisticians who will be handling it, transporters who are handling these components. And that is where you can't have technical personnel at every stage. You will have a totally different kind of people who are handling such equipment. So the foolproofing and their knowledge or handling has to be, the qualifications have to be there for such people also, intermediaries, so that there is no damage in between also that takes place. Because one small damage in the whole system or a ingress will not be detected till the time the item is not de-preserved or it reaches a technical point.
Anybody else would like to comment on this HR aspect of how to manage the transition from storage to usage revival? The next question, which will be our final question, which you can collect your thoughts. I am looking at the final, one or two, core points which you would like to give. Janal Kapoor is back. So go ahead, Janal Kapoor, go ahead.
Right, sir. Now, first is that let's look at anything that comes to you from Amazon today. I mean, it is packed in a DMS-proof, dust, moisture, splash-proof, kind of a package. And therefore, when we look at assemblies, sub-assemblies, components, I think we need to graduate there. Imagine, I mean, just look at it. Maybe a squadron of a tank costs about a couple of 1,000 crores. That is the kind of equipment, and this reliability is contingent upon the weakest link in this tank. Whichever is the weakest link will be the reliability, and therefore we need to make sure that that is firstly taken care. Now, since Jal Matharu had mentioned about HR, I think we need to have people trained who get into this. There's a need to train. We all think that a checklist hai, anybody can do it. No. People must know the nuances of mothballing, the criticalities of mothballing, and it's sorry for saying, but if it's like a sweeper's job, once you do it yourself, you'll realize the difficulty that you have even just sweeping a floor. It is quite a strenuous activity if you do it well. So I think there's a need for training and have trained people on this, number one. Number two, you need to have a team. Like I said, if you look at defense, maybe on a station basis, couple of stations clubbed together into a nucleus where you have the infrastructure for it, and train people to mothball, train people to monitor. Something like a SITREP must get generated periodically to say what were the checks and how did it qualify. And if the way I alluded earlier, if you have a technology-based system, then the SITREP is in real time, you don't need to bother much. But I think those things have to be done. When you look at such crores worth of equipment being mothballed, you need to spend maybe a couple to preserve life, which is very, very important, because you don't know when you will use it. And when you use it, if it is deteriorated, I mean, your exercise is in futility. And of course, a team which then demothballs this, and very important to look at, like General Ghosh mentioned, you need to have a user-oriented staff who should know in how much time do you have for demothballing. That means what is the latency that can be accepted, and therefore you'll need to ginger up the effort accordingly. So to my mind, it's a very important activity. I think we need to, to summarize, like you said, one, R&D on it with a proper research agenda. Second, OEMs to be brought into it because they are directly supplying us something. They do it in their environment. They help us in our environment. Third is technology-based solutions for monitoring and some litmus papers or a litmus test. I think that will cover it well, along with the warehousing that must come up, which is environmentally controlled depending on the requirements.
Thank you so much. Sonal, now closing some closing points from you, whatever you want to say, which crunch points.
Sir, 2 points from my experience from the mothballing part that I have been. Technology has developed and electronics has come in quite a bit. So, firstly, uh, preservation of electronics like heat shrink sleeves and connectors, preservation and all. That is one critical aspect that needs to be looked into for all the advanced equipment that we have. Second part of it, I think, which in aviation especially we need to introduce, and in defense also we need to introduce now with all the electronic checkpoints coming in, is something called use of blockchain. Now, blockchain we have been using it as smart tokens or cryptocurrency and all, but it's got a different aspect of it. That is, it puts a endorsement or a signature at every point that item moves, or at every point the evolution is done on particular or a process is done. So it's kind of a signature that is put, which we need to introduce, wherein accountability happens and checks and balances are certified on at every point for such kind of critical evolutions.
Thank you, Sonal. Air Commander Murali, you're closing some crunch points to guide people.
So as a closing remarks, I would like to just say that in the basic training itself, I think we should be more focusing on this storage. We should imbibe this culture of doing it the right way, and there is only one way to do it. There are no shortcuts. This has to be imbibed not only in the basic training and subsequent con-trainings, also in major courses, especially supervisory level courses. And for example, like if I have an aircraft which has to be this thing, the onboard computers and sensors can be easily removed and put in an air-conditioned this thing. So that reduces half the problems of storage for me. Nowadays, aircraft, all even the your army vehicles, all everything is coming with onboard computers, and so these has to be removed. And that kind of mindset and awareness should be developed in people. As far as the storage cases are concerned, at least for the complex part, when the procurement is done, they should buy certain percentage of these complex cases, including for weapons. Today, weapons are all coming in CKD, this thing, they are assembled for launch. But then after assembly, there is no case available to store. I had a weapon which I had indigenized myself in Kanpur, and we supplied at 3/4 of the cost of an imported one. So we should buy and then reverse engineer in our own workshops and make more quantities. That will be a solution for us economically also. And another thing in the warehousing which I would like to say is the temperature, and as Anil Kapoor and Gen Ghosh also rightly brought out. But the temperature, what generally people do is at the end of the day, morning when they come for work, they switch on the ACs, and night when they go, switch off the ACs. At least in few places. That is not, that there should be two ACs. If there is only one AC required in a particular area, there should be two ACs provided. This is a small expenditure for us, but it's a long-term gain. So the temperature has to be monitored throughout this thing with something like what we do in the communications this thing, where it is a very well laid out thing that has to be impressed upon the logisticians especially. That's all my points.
Thank you, Gen Ghosh.
Sir, to conclude, what I would like to say is that firstly, it is an operational necessity which will determine the requirement of preservation and mothballing. Operational requirement in terms of the armed forces, military, or the civil. Applicability is for all sectors. It can be food and beverages, it can be civil aviation, it can be military, in all the three services that we have. So the operational necessity will first determine. Essentially, it is going to be an engineering activity. However, there will be a requirement of having the HR where you will have a look at the long-term gains of the whole thing. It is a long-term gains in terms of requirement being cyclical. Look at high-cost equipment, the complete weapon, complete system or subsystems, both. Look at the financial offsets in the long-term disruptions which are likely to take place, for which you are catering for this particular preservation activity or mothballing activity. After you have found your nucleus, You have got your strategy through. You start executing it and execute it to the best possible way. Carry out your warehousing requirements. Ideal would be to have a warehouse where the entire thing goes and everything is happening there in terms of vacuuming, of dehumidifying. Everything comes under one roof, which is possible in a warehousing because the space requirements go up. But that is the ideal, I think, the best solution, which is not achievable or not a feasible option as such. And finally, whenever you do these activities, please keep a record of it, because you know that is it a short term or is it a long term one? And in case you have to shift between short term to long term, like periodical demands getting demand and recovery of demand or supply demand position changing, so you will be able to activate that once you have your records very clear. So as a summation, it is the entire package which has to come in, and of course offset by what is the cost benefit analysis of the whole things. Thanks.
Thank you, General Ghosh. I would now, for the final closing remarks, I will go to General Kapoor again. General Kapoor, please.
To my mind, it's a strategic call. When we look at the whole thing, whether it is the production agency, OEM, or it is the armed forces, it's a hugely strategic call. The senior management must be defining preservation and storage of equipment not in use over long periods of time, because the big picture is always available with them. And while I alluded to the Nissan example, like in US, there are only 3 places in the whole of United States where they actually carry out this. And at other places it is supplied. So it's a strategic call they've made. And therefore, I think that firstly, it's a command function for sure. It's a strategic call which has to be taken at the highest level. We need to develop, we have enough depots available even in the armed forces today. And I think they can be developed into models of mothballing and preservation. And I mean, it's like when you go on holidays, don't mind my saying, you know, if you have a pet, you give a pet to a pet store where they look after it the way you would want it to be looked after, and then you come back and receive it. So it's something like that, that you create these warehouses where users, based on the command decision in a particular formation, take that call, get it nicely mothballed, and retrieve it on call whenever required. So I think it's a strategic call to do it, the big picture, and a tactical call to execute it as a small picture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those summing up. So, viewers, you can see that it is a seemingly innocuous type of subject like storage, preservation, and mothballing is so complex. And now, because the costs of equipment which are being put into this storage is so high, it has to be given a large amount of attention at strategic level and tactics level, and the procedures have to be done, and training has to come in, and HR. This is what some of the ideas which are coming out from this very eminent panel of ours. And of course, in the show notes, you will find the links to their profiles, and if anybody wants to contact any one of our panelists for further guidance and advice, you're most welcome to do that, and they'll be happy to respond. With that, we come to the end of another panel discussion from MRO Digest Forums. We have got many members with a lot of expertise, and we'll keep bringing them onto panels so that you can get to know their wisdom. And so it remains for me to thank the panel once again. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.